Thank you very much, Jack. I am so honored that you've asked me to be the one of the Rachel Carson Distinguished Lecturers, and it's a pleasure to accept, and it's an honor. I'm also very pleased to be able to contribute to the celebration of the 20th anniversary of your center, which is doing remarkable and very notable work. So this is a pleasure on many, many fronts. So I want to talk to you about urban ecology, but I want to also emphasize it goes beyond the city. So let's get started. Here's what I'm going to talk about. Start out talking a little bit about how Rachel Carson casts a shadow that influences urban ecology. I'll need to unpack both urban and ecology. We all know, sort of in an informal way, what urban means or what ecology means, but people who are experts in urban may not know everything about the way that we think about ecology. And likewise, those of us in ecology may need a little bit of um, light in the very complex area of urbanism. I want to talk about urban ecology's prepositions. Those are familiar ideas of in, of, and with the city. And then I want to really extend things a little bit and talk about co-production, not just in the sense of co-production of actionable knowledge, but the actual co-production of urban places, urban systems themselves. And then we'll wrap up by talking about sort of regional approaches to urban, which include the kinds of contributions that Jack has been so important in and leading in with teleconnection. So the shadow of Rachel Carson, of course, she really had such an amazing impact on both science and practice policy. She really had a lot to do with the understanding of the oceans and the sea as wilderness that needed to be conserved. And I'm going to point to a couple of things that a recent paper has noted that only about 13% of the ocean is in official wilderness areas or protected areas. Very little of that remains in coastal areas like coral reefs, of course, because so many of the human population of the world live in coastal areas. And only 5% or so of the marine wilderness is in fact protected. So she really pointed to the need to take that wilderness very seriously, in addition to her work in Silent Spring, which, as Jack has said, really helped get the, the idea of environmentalism, environmental activism, environmental improvement scholarship on our agenda. But one of the things that she did was to really call attention to the fact that humans were embedded in environments and interacting with environments. So she was one of the early people who really, I think, got us all to think more about human nature interactions. And that's a big thing that urban ecology, of course, has to follow up on. So here I'm going to start to unpack urban and ecology, because if we're going to combine these things, we have to have a good understanding of what each one of them means or the scope of each one of them. So first, let's unpack ecology in urban ecology. And I go to an old school definition of ecology, the scientific study of the distribution and abundance of organisms and the interactions between organisms and environment. Very classic, something that you find in a lot of ecology textbooks even today. Now, one of the things that we do with urban ecology, and this, I pulled this from Wikipedia just because it's an example of a very common kind of definition of urban ecology. The study of how living organisms interact with each other and their environment. That's the classic definition of ecology that we just saw. And they add in urban areas. Now, what does that mean? Is just adding a kind of place enough to really define what urban ecology is about? And I think I'm going to try to show you that there's more to it than just a place label, and that how we think about the place is actually pretty complex, or can be pretty complex. And then the other thing is, it's not just the area, of course, it's what people do. It's the structures they build, the decisions they make, the problems they generate, the problems they're worried about solving. So how do we deal with ecology in that context? Now, this is a newer definition of ecology. Some of the same core ideas are still in there. The scientific study of the processes influencing the distribution and abundance of organisms, so microbes, animals, plants, the whole smear of living things, the interactions among organisms and the interactions between organisms, and the transformations and flux of energy, matter, and information. So we've added some things to this definition. And we find really this is trying to represent how ecology has grown over the sort of 100 years of its history, starting with organisms, always keeping what organisms do at the core, but really saying there's a much broader context of what that means and how it connects. What do you notice about this definition? Two things. One, the scientific study of is in brackets. So ecology can mean the process of generating knowledge, but it can also mean, if you take that bracket out, it can also mean the knowledge that's created. So it's two things. It's a process and it's a body of knowledge. And it deals with processes, it deals with interactions, and it deals with transformation. So these are verb heavy ideas. These are action heavy ideas. And ecology really is clearly a science of relationship, which is very appropriate for urban things. Now let's unpack urban a little bit in urban areas. So we need to go into the larger global context and concepts that urbanization excites these days. And one of the first ways to notice this complexity is that there are many, many words that we could have used to talk about the topic of this lecture. We can talk about a city, the city. We can talk about urban. We can talk about city, suburb, exurb complexes, broad landscapes. We can talk about urban agglomerations, meaning that cities aren't just isolated anymore. They are really connected across broad regions. And the urban megaregion, in fact, encompasses some of this breadth and extent, spatial extent. The metacity, for those of you who are familiar with concepts like the metapopulation in ecology or the meta-community in ecology, think about cities as being sort of neighborhoods or districts that change, that increase in density or scope, decrease in density or scope. So just like populations or communities, there are spatial aggregations that are dynamic. So that's what the metacity is to get us to pay attention to. The WUI, or wildland urban interface, is something that is becoming much more widely known, especially as we read or in the papers or see the news about the wildfires that move from quote wilderness or rural areas into now very densely populated areas. So it's not just a fringe kind of idea anymore. It's not just an idea about the peri-urban or the urban fringe. So all of these kinds of things need to be taken into account when we think about urban. So that's part of our unpacking. Another thing that we need to be aware of is that if you think about the whole global collection of cities, there are some big things that pop out. One of them is that it's very diverse. The global collection of cities is very diverse. So you can't talk about one sort of trajectory of urban change or urban development. And that's a key idea. The cities are now also very complex internally, but also complex in their dynamics and complex in how they interact with other systems. So complexity is a real key characteristic. Cities or urban areas are diffuse. The boundaries are porous. And it's important to recognize that we have movements of all sorts of things in and among and across urban areas. And that leads us to the final big idea that they're connected. They're not isolated anymore. And again, I point to the Jack Liu's big contributions in this field. So these are four ideas. The global urban estate, the global urban collection is diverse, it's diffuse, it's complex, and it's connected. So that is going to shape what urban ecology needs to be doing. Complexity On the upper left, you see a land cover map, false color infrared of Baltimore. In the middle, you see the racial composition. Each dot represents individual people, and you see the combination of different racial categories used in the U.S. Census: Black, White, Asian, Latin, Latinos. So it's a complex arrangement of social identities. Going down to the right, so 3 o'clock, you see an old topographic map, an old map of the city of Poughkeepsie, New York, where I live. And what that emphasizes is that there's a big river, the Hudson River, but you have a little creek that runs through it. That's in the funny bright blue. And you have hills and you have bluffs. And this sort of template, this geomorphic template, this environmental template really shapes the city even today. Where are the roads? Where are the houses? Where are the neighborhoods that are wealthy? Where are the neighborhoods of working people, for example? And then down in the lower parts at 6 o'clock, you see a map of social networks of organizations that are concerned with environment or justice in Baltimore at a particular point in time. So you can look at this as a dynamic too. So lots of modes of complexity in urban systems. Diffuse, this is just one example from Europe, from the Netherlands. The Hague and Amsterdam sort of run together. Yes, you can find low population areas throughout, but as a discrete sort of urban versus non-urban area is very, very hard to find in many places in the world anymore. Now here, the idea of connection, this represents how connectivity in US cities has changed over time. So this is a bit of a simplification, but you start at the top. Urban areas or cities and rural areas are discrete, sometimes literally in the colonial era with walls around the cities, hence Wall Street in New York City, for example. And you see on the right-hand column, you see the kinds of connectivities that might have been characteristic of those time periods, horse-drawn trolleys and the post-mail. And in metropolis, the idea that some cities become really major controllers of national interest or regional interest, but other cities are clustered around them and interact. The rural is still relatively discrete, and you have other kinds of communication. That black thing over there on the right in the metropolis row is a telephone. Yes, they didn't fit in your pocket back in the day. Megalopolis, the next stage, cities appear in strings or clusters. Megalopolis was first recognized from Boston down to DC, tied together by heavy rail, powered by coal, and but evolving into automobile connections and more instantaneous communication modes like computers, internet, and so on. The mega region says that even those megalopolises are part of larger regions where rural and wild and city are mixed very, very intimately. And the transportation is fast, the communication is fast. So that's the idea of connectivity, multiple scales. And this is an example of the commuting map of the Northeast megaregion in 2010. The biggest transfer that you see in here is kind of the green up in the upper half, and that's from New York to other counties beyond New York. But you see Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC, Newark, for example, also in there, involved in this massive transfer, daily transfer of people back and forth. Diverse. This shows you just some examples of cities in Asia, in Africa, and Europe, and the United States. When you do urban ecology, you really have to have a sense of how the richness of community of urban areas is really quite great. So what happens? How can we use this new definition of urban ecology? excuse me, urban ecology is the study of how living organisms, we've seen that before. Even in Wikipedia, they say it's an interdisciplinary field that combines biological and social sciences. Now that's pretty interesting. Let's look at how we apply this using the ecosystem concept from ecology. The classic definition is that it's a biotic complex, here labeled biota, and a physical complex labeled physical environment, interacting with each other within a certain boundary, an area or a volume of the Earth's surface. And that we can use in urban ecology too, but it's probably a good idea to be very explicit that the humans are a part of these urban ecosystems. They're not separate. They are really embedded in it. And there are social structures that we need to shine a light on. And the constructed environment, not just the buildings and the roads or the wires, but the fact that we move earth around, we fill, we cut off the top of some high points, we rechannel streams and bury streams, for example. So that's part of construction. And in all cases, we can deal with the inputs of materials, energy, waste, and the outputs of those things as well. But when we're dealing with people, things that come in and out of these ecosystems will include money, capital, credit, cultural influences, styles of living, that kind of thing. So we have to really make it richer. Here is a diagram from Gary Mackless and colleagues and Bill Birch, who was his advisor, talking about the human ecosystem. What are the components of the human ecosystem? They're resources, but they're also a social process, a set of social processes that include the institutions that allow and facilitate life and organize people in social order, social cycles. That refers to the fact that these social institutions, these social arrangements change through time, sometimes abruptly, sometimes gradually. The resource system includes the things, the biophysical resources that a classical ecology textbook would have, but it also has to include cultural resources and socioeconomic resources. One of the things that even this simple diagram does is to show that cities and urban places are hybrids of people and nature, natural processes, biogeophysical processes, social, political power influences as well. This is where we're going with urban ecology. Now, urban ecology in the United States, I'm really talking about mostly the United States here because that's my experience. It's the easiest thing for me to pull up. And when we started doing urban ecology in say New York City, which is where I started, we were concerned with ecology in green places or in blue places, in the streams, the lakes, the forests. So we could do what we usually did as ecologists, just do it in the city and try to be sensitive to what was socially and infrastructurally going on around those green places. But this soon led us to understand that we had to do more than understand the ecology in the isolated green or blue areas. So this is a map of Berlin showing the big green spaces in the city of Berlin, which is one of the cities where urban ecology was begun. And it really now is a city that it's a good example of how people started out by looking at ecology in the city. But ecology in the city soon gets you to say, well, all right, what are really the things that connect these green and blue places with the human processes and the human structures, the built and constructed aspects. Now, this is a cycle, starts out on the right with the geophysical and infrastructural template. And what we're concerned with here, as so many people in cities have been, is how the water quality influences things downstream. In Baltimore, the downstream is the Chesapeake Bay, which is required to be cleaned up by the Clean Water Act. And so the assumption was from agricultural and wild areas that the riparian structures, the riparian vegetation along the streams would would convert polluting nitrate to nitrogen gas, denitrification. And so there was an expected service down there at the bottom at 6 o'clock of nitrate retention by urban streams. And so the urban managers in many cities, Baltimore included, said, well, we need to improve our riparian vegetation. We need to restore it. We need to connect the streams with the riparians. And that's what was expected. Mary Cadenasso did a nice survey of this. This is one of the watersheds in Baltimore. The red dots are the water monitoring stations where there were instruments, but also grab samples for water chemistry. And when we looked at these data, what we found was that there wasn't the expected nitrate retention in those riparian zones. And so the conversations with the managers and communities exposed that. And what that made them realize is that their riparian management strategy wasn't going to work. So they decided that really what they needed to do was treat the whole city like a riparian to the extent that you could do that. And how they did that, how they planned to do that, was to say, we need to really extend the canopy of the city of Baltimore and the county as well. But that's a really sort of radical kind of dealing with ecology and the social side together. And there's a feedback. So if these urban tree goals are met, then you could have improvements in flooding, improvements in the urban watershed connectivities, so the lateral connectivity, and you could overcome the riparian disconnection and increase the natural, the nature-based solution, the nature-based process of nitrate denitrification. And this is a map of the red shows the areas that the City Office of Sustainability identified as high priority for tree planting. And as you move into darker green, lower priority. Most of those greener neighborhoods have a lot of tree canopy already. Average tree canopy in Baltimore, 21%. And the goals by the 2030s are about 40%. Now that illustrates a shift from being concerned only with the comfortable places for ecologists in cities, but thinking about the ecology of the entire city. And so the urban tree canopy illustrates that. This is a map of the 5 counties around Baltimore and Baltimore City in the middle. And you can see the standard land cover classifications. Red is commercial, yellow is residential, forest is dark green, agriculture is light green. So we really can think about this whole thing as a system, as a social ecological system. But to do so, you really have to understand some of the social things much more subtly than most ecologists have been trained to do. Here's a satellite image of a part of Baltimore, and clearly there's trees and vegetation in there. But it's important to link that to the property regimes, how the property is managed, not necessarily how it's owned, but how it's managed, who's in charge of managing it. And this shows the vegetation. Dark green trees, light green is grass and shrubs, and the gray is building or pavement. Lay the property map on top of this, the tax map that shows where the property boundaries are, and you are suddenly confronted with the idea that there are hundreds, thousands of forest managers in a city. And if you're going to do something as a city on your public right-of-way to increase your tree canopy, you're going to be pretty disappointed because there's not really that much of it that you are directly in charge of. So that means you have to start understanding how individual property owners, individual tenants think about trees, what they might be educated about to use trees to help this public good, as well as their own personal or local environmental quality and quality of life. So the private land vegetation has to be in play, but you can't tell people what to do. So there's a lot of engagement, a lot of discussion, and ecology became a part of that discussion. Now, when you start thinking about different communities, how many people live in the city, what their capacities are, how rich or poor they are, how much power they have, you begin to understand that as an ecologist, excuse me, it's allergy season. You have to really work with people. You just don't walk into a community and say, hey, this is what you should do. Nobody wants to hear that. But this also takes us back to Rachel Carson. Now, this is a quote from a book by David Schlossberg on defining environmental justice. It's one of the fundamentals of that scholarship. And I'll read this. Both environmental justice and ecological justice can be addressed. The model here, in a way, is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. There, Carson was able to bring together these two previously unconnected environmental concerns, that for the natural world and the concern for human health and industrial impacts on individuals and communities. Now, I hadn't been thinking of Rachel Carson as a pioneer of urban ecology, but this is really foundational. So our debt to her is just, it's immense. Now, the trick is for working with the city, with communities, who decides? With whom do you work? Environmental justice deals with fairness and restitution, not just pure equity that keeps or equality that keeps a current status in place. And in order to address environmental justice, you have to think about the distribution, the spatial distribution of amenities, goods, bads, disamenities, and hazards. So the distribution is a part of it. And that's where it started. People noticed that a lot of environmentally harmful installations were in or adjacent to communities of color and communities of people who did not have a great deal of wealth. But it's not just that's the outcome that you hope for. You hope for these kinds of deficits to be corrected. The processes that are required for that include, well, everybody who's affected by a decision has to participate. But it's not enough to invite them to a meeting and have them sit around the table. You need to listen to what they're saying. You need to respect their voices and make sure their voices are heard. In sometimes areas that have, or situations where they're very different distributions of power, political, economic power, for example. So representation covers that concern. And then you also have to deal with capacities. What kinds of things do people come to the table with, come to the discussion with? Do they come with a good supply of knowledge? Do they come with the capacity to react, to deal with the kinds of interventions that might be decided? So these are things that Schlossberg, for example, talks a great deal about, and this has been expanded a lot in the recent past. So now urban ecology with the city. One example is some work that we did in Baltimore and beyond, saying a lot of people talk about green infrastructure as though it's always good everywhere for everybody. And I love trees and green pretty much, but it's really worth asking, how equitably is green infrastructure distributed across cities? And how do residents in underserved neighborhoods perceive green infrastructure. And then beyond Baltimore, how do urban sustainability plans address equity and environmental justice? So let's look at this. This is a map of two kinds of green stormwater infrastructure in the city of Baltimore. The blue triangles are those installations that are required with a by the city for a development project. You build a big factory, you build a big office building, you build a big residential complex. You have to have green infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure involved in that as a part of the city, the regulation process of the city. The green circles are voluntary green stormwater infrastructure installations, about 200 of each kind here. And those are put in by sometimes community groups, sometimes not-for-profit groups that are aiming to improve the life of underserved neighborhoods. And the question is, well, how are these things distributed? And we find that in the right-hand column, that's some graphs of comparisons of regulatory and voluntary green stormwater infrastructure in Baltimore based on racial categories. There's no significant difference there. Income, no significant difference there. Education, that's to the high school level, no difference there. But vacancy, vacant buildings, vacant lots is really shows up a difference. The voluntary green stormwater infrastructure is really emphasizing vacant lands, and it's also emphasizing areas that have an excess of impervious or paved surfaces. So the outcome here is a good outcome for justice, but there's still problems with representation because often the voluntary green stormwater infrastructure assumes that the local community will do a lot of the maintenance, if not all of the maintenance. Now that's an added burden that does not show up in the regulatory green stormwater infrastructure. So it's not, there's injustice there. Now, looking at the 20 cities and 122 plans, and there's a website down at the bottom that summarizes this work. We had a really interesting interdisciplinary group doing this. 39% of these 122 plans that are relevant to green infrastructure. They're not all plans say this is a plan about green infrastructure in the title, but 39% of them don't define green infrastructure. I mean, is it a park? Is it a bioswale? Is it a curb cut? Is it a tree planting program throughout the whole city? 59% of those that do define green infrastructure focus on stormwater, and that's because of the EPA stormwater regulations that cities have to respond to. And even within a city, green infrastructure may mean different things to different agencies. So that might mean that you're not having kind of an optimal planning. You might even be having confliction between different kinds of plans. 26% of the plans do refer to equity, but only 16% say what they think that means. And if you don't say what you think that means, that also says that you don't know how you're going to attain it. 67% claim engagement with affected communities. Very, very few of the plans actually say how that's going to be done and how representation is going to be ensured, for example. And then, oh, look at that spelling here. But 30% of the green infrastructure plans assume that it's a universal good. It's good for everybody all the time, everywhere. One of our collaborators, Amanda Phillips DeLucas, who's now head of a not-profit in Baltimore, the Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, did a sort of a simulation, a participatory simulation that allows people, whether you're a community member, a government agent, or a not-for-profit leader, allows you to sort of put on each of those hats and see what comes up when you think about installing green infrastructure. So that's one of the ways that we could see helping cities to say what they meant and how they would attain it. Okay, co-production of urban ecosystems. The big idea here is that heterogeneity begets heterogeneity. This looks like circular logic. If you put time in the picture, it becomes something that you can assess and measure, and you can see drivers, heterogeneity at time 0 is a driver on the left, and moves through time as an outcome for the next generation that then becomes a driver for the subsequent time period. These blue arrows represent both biophysical processes that can be changed or change, and human perceptions and interventions that change over time. So heterogeneity is a really good tool to bring us together in social ecological thinking. Here's a quick example: the emerald ash borer in Toledo, Ohio. Add the insect, 3 years later, all the ash trees have been killed. Now, there's a patchy distribution of ash trees, and you can either manage the ash borer, which is very expensive. You're not going to do that many places, or you can cut down the ash trees, and in either case, you have a patchy mortality of ash trees. The city of Poughkeepsie just cut down all its ashes. But what happens with that patchy distribution? Do you let succession go? Do you plant replacement species? Or do you say, we give up on this spot, we're just going to build something there or pave it? So there are outcomes here: patchy distribution of shade and surface temperature, which of course influences urban heat island effects. So this shows the importance of this sort of social ecological integration across time and heterogeneity. The big idea: ecosystems, urban ecosystems, are co-produced by biogeophysical processes, natural processes that are occurring in cities, and human structures, human decisions, human interventions, co-production, not of actionable knowledge, but actually co-production of the place that are our cities and urban places. That's kind of a big shift in how you think about it. All right, down to the stretch. Urban ecology beyond the city. The Regional Plan Association has identified these areas as the growing mega regions in the United States. You can find mega regions throughout the world, urban mega regions. And these things, they're obviously direct urban effects in the highly built up areas. There are indirect urban effects that go beyond those areas. There is, now we've talked about co-production. You can think about all of the areas on this map as being some sort of co-product of urban influences, urban structures, urban decisions, and rural or wild conditions, and sort of unintentionally managed, or not intentionally managed, I should say, processes. And you have the distant connections. Now, Henry Lefebvre said in 1968 that society was completely urbanized. And what this meant was that the urban fabric was having an influence, that urban areas were having influences well beyond their borders. So this suggests what you might call a continuous mixture of things that you can classify as urban at one extreme, and that's down the left-hand side, or rural or wild at the other extreme. But it's really worth asking the question, what happens in situations where these things actually, these attributes are mixed, where it's not just pure urban or pure rural? So this is something that was explored initially in a paper in 2014 at a meeting, a wonderful meeting in Germany, and Jack Liu was an important participant in that meeting. So in the middle is this concept of the urban-rural continuum, or urban-rural spectrum. The upper left is a blank map of some region. You can run that map through your idea of the urban-rural continuum, and then you map an actual landscape, an actual region based on the mixtures of urban and rural characteristics. This shows this is a different kind of complexity. What are characteristics? You can have urban livelihoods, rural livelihoods. You can have lifestyles that are predominantly rural based or wild focused, or lifestyles that are city based. And then you have the linkages or connections across regions. And finally, of course, these three things, livelihood, lifestyle, and linkages or connectivities, affect individual places, affect local ecosystems. The local ecosystems, of course, filter some of these other three interactions. So there's a really sort of complex feedback that can be regional in scope. This is a new sort of way of thinking about urban areas that I believe to have a lot of promise. Well, that was animation I didn't need to leave in there. I'm going to give you a final little example of this just to point to it. This is the Yangtze Valley in Beijing. Beijing is a huge administrative unit, and on the northeast side of Beijing, there is this valley. The map of the valley is in the middle of the slide here. And down at the bottom, number 3, one of the components of the continuum of urbanity concept or framework, one of the things that we've been noticing that people have been noticing, and it needs to be more quantified, is that as feeder roads into the valley, expressways and local roads improve the connectivity, as people can connect regionally and even internationally through express delivery of materials or internet, this little valley becomes connected to the bigger city, the core city of Beijing, but also to other areas. Look at number 1, livelihood. One of the things that's happening is that people are shifting from working on farms and orchards to running hotels, running restaurants, and to renting out some or all of their properties for vacationers. You can find online ads in English, presumably in other languages, but I didn't look for them in other languages, for renting out rooms in the Yangtze Valley. That's a serious kind of connectivity. Lifestyles are changing. Household sizes change as kids abandon the farms, as leisure activities become really important locally to the local residents and to the people who come and visit there. It really shows this regional ecology is this mixture. And some of the slow variables are the things that ecologists might traditionally study. What's the number of cars that come in here? What's the vegetation index? What's the water quality? How's your wildlife doing? How much farming continues or not? So here are the change variables. And household size, again, I have to point to Jack Liu's contribution to understanding or having us understand much better that it's not just the density of people, but it's the household structure that matters for the environmental impact of people. So this is a case of how the continuum of urbanity might work. Rachel Carson helped us to think about human and nature together. Urban and ecology both need to be better unpacked for synthesis in urban ecology, and so there's some new conceptions that can help us with that. The prepositions of urban ecology in, of, with are a trajectory that moves from understanding to intervention on behalf of justice and equity. Co-production of urban systems is a really powerful way to think differently about cities and urban places, which I hope will help us do a better job of connecting it with what people actually need. Urban and rural areas are hybrid. Okay, I think I'm done.
Great. Thank you so very much, Dr. Pickett, for your really fantastic lecture. It's very informative, insightful, inspiring. And now it's time for questions. Again, the audience is welcome to post question in the Q&A box. And I already see a question there now. So I'll read the question to you. This question is from Logan Heisen. His question is, on your slides about the equity of green infrastructure, you mentioned that the voluntary green infrastructure project often place the maintenance burden on community. Has that burden surprised voluntary green infrastructure project? And how can that burden be reduced?
Some organizations, I think, had a very sort of simplistic view. It's, if you build it, they will come, so to speak. And it's vegetation, it'll take care of itself. And I think a lot of organizations were disappointed that this agreement of communities to maintain areas was not the ideal situation. One thing, for example, if people weed or prune in their community green space, sometimes the city doesn't have enough, they don't come and pick up the the debris, the maintenance debris, the branches, the cuttings and things like that. So there's some things that could be improved by city capacity to help people. But really, the big thing with almost all of these green infrastructure interventions, including some of the ones in the regulatory categories, that there's not enough attention or resources put on the table for maintenance, so it becomes a burden.
Well, thank you. The next question actually say, will the recording be available for the attendees? Yes, Dr. Pickett has kindly agreed to make the recording available on the website for the lecture series so that you can visit the website there. The next question is, you propose a lot of great ideas, and for new student in this area, how can they, effectively pursue urban ecology beyond cities? What kind of advice you would give to a new PhD student, how to do that?
Well, first of all, I think it really is important to keep the big ideas in mind, but graduate work or undergraduate honors theses, all of it needs to pick something that is doable. And if you look at that sort of the list of things around the Yanqi Valley, which is, you could ask those questions about the continuum of urbanity in pretty much any place. We've asked questions like that in the Hudson Valley, which is a 10-county area that runs from New York City up to Albany. And you can find something in there, something in that list that you say, oh, I can measure that, or I can measure this in collaboration with somebody in another discipline so that we get a richer answer, a more sort of integrated answer. So I think there's that maybe as a shopping list, but keep the big idea in mind, but pick something that you can do and finish within the time available.
Great, that's excellent suggestions. The next question is from George Bird. He said, how important is the term suburbia in the science of urban ecology?
Well, you notice when in one of my early slides where I had the list of terms, I didn't pull out suburbia. Actually, I linked suburbia with city suburb, exurb, and then by implication, the wildland urban interface. So what's classified as suburban is actually in the United States is actually the area where more people live than in core cities anymore. So the urban population of the United States as a whole is about 84% of the population, and most of them live in suburban areas. The suburbs are a really important component of the urban topic that we have to uh, understand and research, and especially since often suburban areas are very highly divided, depending on what state you're in, and they're very highly divided as different government units. And so the coordination for policy, the coordination for environmental improvement, and so on is difficult in those situations. So it's important to recognize, as I do, suburbs in the mix.
Great. The next question is from Jeremy, Gianna. Did the city say why the denitrification in the waterways did not work?
Well, we help them to understand that basically urban streams with the high amounts of impervious surface, cities are designed to move water off of the surface quickly. Even cities in dry places are designed for that. And so what that means is that when you have big storms, there's incredible erosion focused in the streams. So urban streams are often cut down very deeply into the substrate. And what that means is that the water table recedes. So the floodplain becomes isolated from the water table, isolated from the stream. And it's the anaerobic conditions that happen in saturated soils that allow the bacteria that do the denitrification to function. So that's why it's disconnected, and that's just basic sort of microbial ecology. But this is one of those examples where you got this policy. It works out in the countryside, so it'll work in cities. And we just need to think, what are the differences? What are the mechanistic differences? And sometimes we're going to be surprised.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, we have audience from around the world. The next question is from someone in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Xiaodong Qin. He said, Dr. Pickett, what do you think are the implications of the urban-rural connections for the sustainability of urban and rural areas, respectively? So what's the implication for the sustainability for urban areas? What's the implication for the sustainability for the rural areas?
I understand that concern is actually a big concern in China right now. And the simple answer is that you have to consider the cities, the suburbs, the towns, and the countryside, the farms, the grazing land, the forests. You have to consider them as part of each other. And to really have sustainability take into account that co-production and that connection. In fact, if we try to sustain cities without understanding how they're connected to their resource sheds or their waste sheds or their even population migration source areas, we're not gonna do a very good job.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So the next question is from anonymous attendees. The question was, invasive tree-killing insects and passengers continue to damage and kill urban trees. In the case of emerald ash borer, you showed the green ash trees in Toledo. they made a statement to the effect that ash tree must either be protected, which is terribly expensive, and now nobody is going to do that, or removed. So your community remove the ash, which correspond to a substantial loss of stormwater uptake and other ecological services those trees provided. The facts are that ash tree can be treated effectively with minimum no non-target problems, while track injection and systematic products. Dozens of research studies have compared cost of ash treatment versus scenarios of tree removal, and without the exception, the cost of treatment are much lower. If ecological services are included, the difference is even more pronounced. Please dig into this topic further. Numerous cities successfully manage the ash resources. So it's a long comments, and basically it's how to address this ash tree issues.
I think that I was presenting the Poughkeepsie case as a case that was what happened. And what I was trying to do there was to talk about the idea of these decisions being, this is a case of co-production. It is absolutely true that the people in the city who made that decision were clearly not aware of the options to treat and the costs of losing ash trees. I think that's I shouldn't condemn. I shouldn't sound too condemnatory, but I think that this is a case where cities can usefully reach out and include input from people who have the knowledge, like you were talking about, of the costs and benefits of interventions. That's one of the services that urban ecology can provide. This was a case where there was not a thought in the city that they did not seek additional input. There was a decision that was made and appeared on the street. But yes,
Great.
we do
Yeah,
need to know about that kind of thing better in more cities and get that word out.
Great. So let's see whether we have the time for one or two more questions. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Okay. So the next question is, you mentioned from Matt Hemmler, you mentioned the assumption that is often made that green infrastructure is always good. What are some ways that the green infrastructure could have negative effects? He said, I have heard residents in Baltimore being concerned that investment in green infrastructure in their neighborhood will raise property values and lead to gentrification and increased property tax burdens.
That there are many sorts of things that you have to put in the balance sheet of green infrastructure. And even though these things may sound like just quantifying costs and benefits, some of it really needs to be thought, and that it's therefore it's just the sort of neutral working of a market. The issue of gentrification is something that impinges on policy, impinges on that. A city, an agency can actually contribute to managing a market in a way that will not lead to displacement of long-term residents or residents who are not who do not have great political power. That's something I think we as a society need to think more seriously about, and to make the benefits of green infrastructure available to people who live in places without risking their displacement. But people are worried about damage from falling trees. They're worried about the cost of pruning, which often falls on residents rather than on city agencies. So there are a whole mix of things that would make it not good for everybody everywhere.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're already a few minutes over, but we'll have last question. Okay. This from Fatima Karen. He said, Dr. Pickett, in the context of urban ecology, how important do you think changing people's lifestyle is, such as encouraging green shopping habits, reducing overconsumption, or moving away from fast fashion in promoting sustainable urban ecosystems? From my understanding, we have already reached the Earth Overshoot Day, and it seems to be coming earlier each year. This makes me wonder, isn't change lifestyle pattern equally important in maintaining the balance within urban ecological systems and ensuring long-term resource efficiency?
Yes, yes, lifestyle really does have an impact, and there are some things that are part of lifestyle that can be easily taught and easily identified. And recycling and composting, which is, for example, New York City is starting to require composting. And it's going to change people will have to change their household and individual behaviors. I don't know how to make people change, so I'm not going to go there. But I think that getting the messages out about not only individual choices, but also institutional choices that can promote sustainability is really important. The bigger issue is how to not be motivated in all things by a profit guidance, but not be guided by profit, which sort of allows people, industries and institutions to overlook their responsibilities to sustainability.
Well, thank you so very much. Yeah, so your presentation and the Q&A are so interesting, but we run out of time. Dr. Pickett, thank you so much again for your wonderful lectures and answers to the questions. And I also want to thank the audience for the active participation. And what we have now to say goodbye to everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day, or have good evening or night, and depending where you are. So thank you all, and Dr. Pickett. Yeah.
Thank you.